Thank you for joining us today. I have with me Michael Fauscette, who is one of our limited number of external contributors that we asked to contribute to the book. Michael, thank you for joining us today. You're a fascinating human being. I'm going to ask you a little bit about your background in a minute, but when someone writes a book, when does the book come out? November?
So the book actually was published in September, so it just came out.
Okay. Maybe in a world that's progressing this fast, that's something I should have read up earlier, but the book is entitled Building a Digital Workforce, Strategies for Agentic Success. I can't imagine that title would have ever got even listing time with a publisher 2 years ago, but it feels to me like that's the North Star, and it's why we asked you to contribute to us in the book, Building a Data and AI Platform with Postgres, transform your business and intelligent data. Give us a little bit of background on you, a bit of background on the book.
Sure. Yeah, no, happy to be here and excited to talk about this. I feel like I talk about agentic AI all day long, and that's fun. It's actually gotten to be a very interesting topic. Well, I came into tech actually. I was a professional musician and a professional photographer for a while, and I stumbled into the Navy to try to figure out what to do. And the Navy said, you'd be a great engineer. So I learned technology thanks to the U.S. government. And when I got out, I started working for software companies. I worked for 7 vendors, including 4 startups back then. And then I went to IDC to run their enterprise application research group as an analyst. Then I went to a startup called G2, unicorn startup that does market analysis, crowdsource reviews, that sort of thing, and was the chief research officer there for 5 years. Still an advisor there, but I started my firm, Arion Research, a little over 4 years ago, with the idea of looking at the intersection between customer experience and AI. Back then, more machine learning and traditional AI, but of course, as we know, the world blew up, and now we're all talking about AI.
It's a remarkable shift, right? So, original NAG algorithms for machine learning have been around 40 years, right? But this dynamic shift is almost like a whole new species of AI and a whole new species of AI and data that we're creating. What do you feel when you look back at the work you did for the book that we're really grateful with, the really big insights that you think people should be reading and looking into when they read the book?
Yeah. Well, the idea was, and I'd been thinking about this for a while, and I think the shift, there's a couple of shifts that I think are different than what we've seen in the past. One of them is we've always thought of AI as a tool. And frankly, until we moved into this agentic era, it was a tool, right? We used it to do a thing. Even generative AI, I tell it to go find this information or write this paragraph or whatever, right? But with agentic, it shifts and it becomes a coworker. And it's a different mindset when you start to think about what that means from a business perspective and how you deploy it and how you treat it going forward. And then the second shift that I think was also very important, and I saw this from generative and into agentic, is that over time, enterprise applications are moving behind the scenes, and that's good because it moves the silos that we created for all those years of data and operation and business and, your organization structure, all those things. It starts to move that back, and you start to shift the focus from applications to workflows, because that's actually how the agentic process is going to work. And so the book really was a series of frameworks and ways to think about that from a strategic perspective and from an implementation perspective. How do I take these agents and build a digital workforce and turn that digital workforce into a hybrid workforce with my human employees? So that's the base concept.
One of the comments that you put in your predictions, which really mixed beautifully with the others we had from people here and IBM, was that the economics of data will fundamentally change. It sounds like a big statement, but I think historically one would have dismissed it. Now it's absolutely fundamentally true. So how do you see this sort of, real-time semantic layer discourse really changing the way we think about the economic value of data?
Well, it's really tied into this shift that we talk about when we look at traditional, generative, and agentic, right? So if you think about the transition there, data in traditional AI was an input and an important input, and it made it function correctly, but the outputs were things mostly historical or things that I used as a tool to do something else. So in other words, I had a human in the way. which is good. But if you move into a world through generative all the way to agentic AI, when we have AI that is autonomous, has agency, the name, all right, agentic. So if it has agency, it means it can take action. So when you move to a world where we start to have these digital workers that can do things, you want to make really sure that the data you've inputted that they have access to is data that they can use to get the right outcome. And part of what makes it agentic is they're goal-based. They have the ability to perceive, they can do analysis, they can plan, they can take an action, and they can learn from that action. Well, all of that is incumbent upon you to have inputted data that's quality data, that's clean data, that's in the right context. I used to think about this a lot when we came out with the term big data. And I always hated it because the only thing I could ever figure out about big data was it was big and it was data, but it didn't do anything for me. It didn't mean anything to me. So what I needed was contextual data, real time, relative to what I'm trying to do, data, relevant. And that's really where you start to think about this real-time semantic layer of availability of the data that matters in the context that you want. But the problem was, and all of my predictions in this were tied around this idea, the problem is we can't just do this by ourselves. Now, luckily, we have agents. So we could start to automate these things and make them function in a different way. And when you think about the economics of it, when I want relevant contextual data, that means it has to be relevant and contextual in what I'm doing or what the agent's doing. And if I'm putting an agent out there that can interact with my customers, for example, maybe it's my tier 1 support. Well, I want to make sure that it has access to the information it needs to solve the customer's problem. And at a certain level, it knows to escalate to a human. That's absolutely critical because even a simple thing like it could give you a wrong answer as a customer. It can truly make your brand at risk in its interactions because it does something wrong based on data that you gave it that's not contextual, not relevant to what it's trying to do. So the only way you can really get there is to automate that and start to think about it in the economic context. I want the data available that is the most relevant and most valuable because all data is not the same. And the same is true with this idea of real-time semantic layer. You want agents to manage that so that the data that is the most relevant and important and valuable in the context of the situation is available. And the other thing is, of course, you want to make sure it's available, access to it, but not moving it, because you don't want to have something that moves all your data around your business like that all the time. Because as you well know, you're going to have a problem, right? It's not going to be seamless. And in fact, you've got the risk of, even more risk of security and privacy issues and all those things.
And compliance failure,
as you
right?
do that. And compliance failure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a whole nother discussion, but governance and compliance and ethics have to be by design, not afterthoughts as a part of this because of that.
Now, there's some terms in the book, and I don't want to give up the chapter of the book, it's fantastic, where you talk about things like insight first architecture, autonomous data economics, causal intelligence layers, cognitive data fabrics. These are remarkable terms, right? And so I think we've seen a world that's evolved really fast in the last 120 days. And we asked you to talk to us about 7 years out. Do you see those terms, those ideas coming quicker than 7 years, longer than 7 years, or at that 7-year mark?
Yeah, that's interesting. So this, every year as an analyst, I always publish some sort of predictions and trends on my own. And I changed the way I do it this year. I came up with this 3-tier structure that I think is really interesting. It's tier 1 is it's in motion now and going to be available during the next year in a broad, distribution, consumption, availability. Tier 2 is something that is happening, but it's moving slower and needs some sort of architectural change. To get there, it's probably a year or so out. And tier 3 is, I can see this, but I know there are a lot of pieces that aren't available yet to make it work. So that's further out. Now, interestingly, we know in the past, technology timelines always compress. We always overestimate the short term and underestimate the long term. And it's a human problem, right? I use the time scale of where I am to predict the time scale of the future, and that's not really how it works, right? So So yeah, I think my 7-year predictions, is that 7 years or 5 years or 3? I don't know. I would at least call those tier 3 that are on the horizon, but some of them require us to learn and build and do some new things before they become possible.
I think that's actually a great sort of sequence into the book, why we wrote it, because the reality is you have to be or want to be your own AI and data platform. You can't just be big data. I think your analysis of it was big, it was data, but what was the purpose? We've shifted to this sort of contextual agentic purpose a lot faster. So Mike, I'd love to thank you for doing this. This is a great interview. The stuff in the book is amazing. And I look forward to talking actually together about this on the podcast we do, AI and Data Horizons. So thank you for joining me today.
Sure. Yeah. Looking forward to it.